Okay, all right. We're really happy to be here. I want to thank George, Rosa, Boris, and Phoebe, comrades at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, for inviting me again to come back and talk to you. And I want to thank you guys for being here. I'm going to talk about several ideas about a book that I'm kind of working on, and it has everything to do with capitalism and democracy, so you won't be disappointed if that's what you came to hear about and you're like, what is this historical stuff? You'll see, hopefully, if I do my job adequately, what the point of this is and what the way in which we can use these historical comparative kind of methods to think about this whole tortured relationship between capitalism and democracy. Also want to recognize and celebrate that it is, of course, today International Women's Day, and so want to recognize that and recognize that this is obviously also one of the signal moments of the outbreak of the Russian Revolution that we shall remember as well, and also would like to express solidarity with what's going on with the students as they struggle against the privatization of higher education in Greece. Okay, so without further ado, kind of get into what I'm going to talk about today. So basically, the talk is going to go through these parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about, kind of generally about the debate about capitalism and democracy in kind of theoretical terms. I'm going to mostly be talking about the kind of Marxist tradition, but not just the Marxist tradition. There'll be references to other theoretical traditions as well. I'm going to introduce a kind of method for thinking about these things in comparative historical terms, talk about the use of comparative method, what we can do with it. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit of comparative data on the US and Germany, mostly from the period between 1870 and 1930, which I think is the kind of key slice of history here that we should look at. And then I'm going to compare the cases on these dimensions that I've listed here. I'm going to talk about what I will call labor repressive agriculture. I'll explain that term. I'm going to talk about bourgeois strength, working class strength in the modern state. The basic message is going to be that the two cases are much more similar along these dimensions than one might think, given their very divergent outcomes, or at least the putatively very divergent outcomes in the mid-20th century, basically in the early 1930s. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of what I will call a permissive versus a restrictive geopolitical environment. And this is going to introduce what I see as the key difference, which is really imperialism. This is the thing that I'm going to emphasize as I go forward and then conclude. Okay. This is part of a broader project, which is kind of a crazy project that I've been working on for far too long. So I'm looking at the question of democracy and authoritarianism across 6 cases in this book that I'm writing. The book is provisionally entitled Special Paths. Hopefully I'll have a better title by the time it comes out, but it's sort of a nod to the debates that were really unfolding in German historiography in the 1990s, this debate about the nature of Germany's special path to the modern world and how special it actually was. And as I say, I'm going to focus on the German and the US cases in these remarks today, because I think if I can get this right, then I should be able to get these other cases working. All right, so what is this capitalism and democracy debate? How should we think about the relationship between the two? So let's just remind ourselves, broadly speaking, about what the stakes are in this discussion, right? I think sort of what theoretical issue we're after here, or the one that I'm after, is what really is the connection between capitalism as a system of production, in which you have one class that holds a social monopoly over the means of production, and in particular holds a monopoly over the power to make decisions about how to invest the social surplus, and what we could think of as representative democracy, just that system in which voters have the right to periodically eject political elites from power. How do those things connect? And more specifically, and as a way of instantiating empirically or thinking empirically about this question, The question I want to pose is, why did the two main capitalist powers of the late 19th century, and here I'm going to think about Imperial Germany and the US after the Civil War, as I've already suggested, why is it that they ended up in such radically different places in the 1930s? What's going on here? And what light does that shed, or what does it not shed, on the capitalism and democracy relationship? Well, okay, so people have different ideas about this. First one that we all know, right? If we think about this, we think about liberal democracy or bourgeois democracy or representative democracy basically as the expression of the strength of the bourgeoisie. This is an old position. It has many advocates from across the kind of political and theoretical spectrum, right? Going back to Lenin, democratic republic with universal suffrage is the best possible political shell for capitalism. Marx, of course, in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie has finally gained exclusive political control through the modern representative state. Kautsky, most explicitly, modern democracy was a product of the capitalist mode of production and was in its origins demanded by capitalism. And then the great historical kind of founder of historical comparative sociology in the United States, Barrington Moore Jr., who was an interesting kind of figure. He was like an aristocratic Marxist. Without going into the evidence further or discussing the Asian materials, the point is in the same direction. We may simply register strong agreement with the idea that a vigorous and independent class of town dwellers, i.e. the bourgeoisie, has been an indispensable element in the growth of parliamentary democracy. No bourgeois, no democracy. So that's one very standard position. It's not necessarily even a particularly Marxist position, of course, actually. Then we have what could be thought of as the kind of opposite position, but within a similar or related tradition. And that is the idea that actually, of course, liberal democracy wasn't at all an expression of the bourgeoisie or bourgeois class power. What it was an expression of the power of the working class, right? So the very prominent political economists, Acemoglu and Robinson, recently expressed the idea this way: industrialization increases social unrest and induces democratization. The kind of political sociologists, Ruschmeyer, Stevens, and Stevens, in the relative class power model of democratization that stands at the center of their framework, it's the size and density of working class organizations that are of critical importance for the advance of democracy. And then Vivek Chibber, who's quite prominent kind of American Marxist sociologist, liberal rights were all won and fought for by working class movements. To describe them as bourgeois is a, quote, dangerous rhetorical ploy. Democratization was mostly the result of subaltern groups, especially labor. So we sort of have two ideas here coming out in a way of a broadly similar tradition. We have the notion that capitalist democracy is the expression of bourgeois class power, and the other notion that no, it's never really been the bourgeoisie. They never really wanted democracy. It was the working class. To the extent that there's a relationship between capitalism and democracy, it's the fact that capitalism creates this new social agent that pushes for democracy against the bourgeoisie. Okay, so then you also, of course, have a kind of tradition of thinking about, you could say, the origins of democracy in political institutional terms. And here I just want to say there are many, many different kind of ways in which this kind of position has been cashed out. Most recently, there's Sherry Berman, who wrote a very big and in many ways very impressive book about the origins of democracy in Europe. And she argues, this is a kind of very standard argument in a way, that really what explains when some countries became authoritarian and others remained democratic is whether or not they had to face certain challenges in a sequential or telescoped or compressed order. So where countries had to face the challenges of state and nation building together with capitalism and mass politics in a short space of time, there you were likely to get authoritarianism. But where these things were somehow spread out over time so that, for example, in the classic case of Britain, you could make a kind of transition to capitalism first, and then you could sort of introduce slowly mass politics and democracy later, somehow that was better for these things. Gregory Lubert, who comes from a kind of related tradition, argues in an argument that I actually think is quite important and that I will be developing to a certain extent in these remarks, suggests that really the key issue is the incorporation or non-incorporation of the working class. That is to say, that working class movements that emerged before the war in liberal societies were basically linked with liberal or bourgeois political parties, and this basically stabilized the political order in such a way that it made liberal democracy possible. So that's kind of the lay of the land in these political institutional theories. Before introducing the kind of alternative that I want to argue for, I want to just take a step back and note something about all these accounts of the relationship so far. They're all resolutely focused on internal factors, right? Basically, they are all treating the problem of capitalism and democracy as a problem that needs to be thought about and investigated in the context of particular nation states that can be contrasted. Now, I think that's very useful. I will talk about the way in which we can think about using comparison to make arguments. But, of course, they completely neglect the geopolitical dimension, right? And it's that geopolitical dimension that I want to bring to bear, basically by thinking about two very different kinds of thinkers and putting them together in this argument. And those two are the great German kind of, I guess I would call him a kind of early historical sociologist, Otto Hintze, and the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. So from Hintze, I want to take this idea. Hintze saw this, of course. Hintze was a very conservative man and was basically making his arguments against what he saw as, you know, this kind of social democratic vulgate that was widespread in Germany at the time of his writing. In the early part of the 20th century, state and people in their external existence are usually regarded as given and unchangeable quantities. People usually investigate only the internal social changes which might have an influence on constitutional forms, but they don't ask whether the characteristics of a state and people might also be determined by their relationship to the external environment. So he introduced this idea of the external environment. And then from Gramsci, of course, the idea of hegemony, which suggested in a way that what had made bourgeois democracy possible was that somehow in those cases where you had it, the bourgeoisie had been able to articulate its particular class interest as a general interest. It was able to articulate its particular interest as the general interest. That's the basic idea of hegemony. And that, in a sense, you could say, to the extent that Gramsci has a theory of bourgeois democracy, it is based on the observation that democracy requires establishment of hegemony prior, right, to the accordance of broad political rights, particularly to the working class. Now, I want to put these ideas together, and I'll see how, basically by suggesting that, in fact, geopolitical position has been a huge determinant of the ability or the failure of the bourgeoisie to make a hegemonic claim vis-a-vis the working class. So that's what I'm going to argue for. How am I going to do that? What's the kind of basic method that I'm going to propose here? My approach is extremely simple. It's a very simple comparative design. I'm going to basically look at, again, as what I was saying, these two major capitalist powers of the late 19th and early 20th century, and ask why they resulted in such dramatically politically different outcomes at the end of the period. The cases I'm looking at are Imperial Germany and the US. And basically, the whole kind of point of the argument is going to be to try to show that these cases don't differ at all in the ways that existing theoretical accounts of capitalism and democracy would suggest that they should differ. And I'm going to further argue that when they do differ, when there are important differences between the cases, and I'm going to acknowledge that there are such differences, they are not in any sense obviously favorable to the case of the US, right? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think a more careful understanding of geopolitics might present a way of solving the puzzle that is posed by that comparison. So if we look at our cases here, basically I'm going to be organizing the argument in these ways. I want you to just sort of, in following what I'm going to be doing here, I'm going to be looking at these cases in terms of what these kind of four big factors that people have talked about in terms of explaining dictatorship and democracy. I'm going to start with this thing called labor repressive agriculture, which has always been considered a really important problem for democracy, right? The basic idea being that, well, you have large landholders who are controlling their rural populations primarily through political rather than what we would think of as normal economic means. This is a big problem for democracy. And where that problem has been eliminated, well, basically this opens the path to democracy. So I'll talk about that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, is it the strength of the bourgeoisie? Is it the strength of the working class? Are there differences, important differences in terms of state structure? And what I'm going to try to argue here is that, in fact, as I'm sort of showing you on this table, in fact, I'm going to argue that labor repressive agriculture was probably more prevalent in the pre-Civil War US than it was in Imperial Germany, that both these countries had strong bourgeoisies, that the German working class was undoubtedly stronger than the US working class, and that they, most controversially perhaps, both had quite modern states, but that the real difference that matters is this geopolitical difference. That's what I'm going to try to argue for. More stuff about method. You probably guys don't care about this. I don't know if anybody's particularly worried about methodology here. If you are worried about methodology, all I'm going to say is basically this type of small and comparative study is extremely useful for developing theoretical ideas. So if you're worried about problems of generalization and things like that, I have many ways that I could convince you to calm down about those things, but we can talk about those in the question and answer session. All right, so let's just start by looking then, sort of after all that scene setting, we can look at some comparative data. Now, in one case, this is probably not, in some ways, terribly convincing slide to start with. But I do want to be honest about the fact that there are real differences here. This is Madison's data on GDP per capita. I'm presenting here data on 4 countries going back to 1870 and running up to 1939. It says 1938 on the thing, but the data actually goes to 1939. Of course, the US was growing at a very rapid rate over this period. It is the gray line, and the UK is the blue line. So these 2 countries are, in some ways ahead of the pack here. The German data is presented as the orange line, but I've also included in this slide the French data, which is the yellow line, okay? And what I want to suggest here is I want to acknowledge, first of all, that in a way, of course, the US is a very rich country. We know that. But it's also the case that that Germany and France are extraordinarily similar, right? So it's unlikely that just this GDP alone is going to be able to explain our differences in outcomes. There are also reasons, in my view, to think that this evidence understates Germany's real economic importance in the 19th century, but we can talk about that as I develop some more comparative evidence in a bit. Let's now consider our 2 cases with the United Kingdom thrown in as a kind of contrast, so you can get a sense of this, in terms of the sectoral distribution of the workforce circa 1910. So if we look at this data, what we see here is that, first of all, going through the main sectors, right? Germany and the US are very similar in terms of the percentage of the population in agriculture, in mineral extraction. In the manufacturing sector, I would note that Germany is outstripping the US by 1910. It has a higher percentage, almost a third of its workforce is in manufacturing. They're basically equal in terms of the other sectors: utilities, telecommunications, distribution, finance, government, slightly more government in Germany than the United States, but not orders of magnitude different. So these two countries are quite similar in terms of the sectoral distributions of their working populations around the first decade of the 20th century. They are very different from the UK, which is interesting. I mean, the UK is a completely different kettle of fish from basically everyone else in this period, primarily because, of course, the UK has a very small percentage, very early date, of its population in agriculture. But if you just looked at this data, you know, the point that you would come away with is, wow, you know, the Imperial Germany and the US look like pretty similar kinds of places in terms of this stuff. Now, let's look at, here I'm just presenting a kind of index of the percentage of the population that works in agriculture, but here I'm presenting it as actually a ratio, the percentage of population that works in agriculture divided by the percentage of population that works in industry. The key comparison here is between the yellow and the black lines. I will note that Germany on this indicator is more, as it were, manufacturing heavy than the United States. That is to say, manufacturing employment is taking up a greater percentage of its economically active population. For a sort of a comparative framework, I've put in the UK again here, which you can see is incredibly you know, manufacturing heavy, basically, in this comparison. And then France, which is more agrarian. But Germany, of all these four countries, right, is, except for the UK, is the most, you know, manufacturing heavy country. So manufacturing is incredibly important. All right, so that's just to give you, that's going to give you a little bit of comparative sense. Now let's turn to just, I'm going to just describe what's going on here in terms of our major variables again. To recall, we're going to start with labor repressive agriculture. How much time do I have, and how? You have plenty of time. I have plenty of time. Okay, all right, very good, okay. So let's start with this business about labor repressive agriculture. Remember what I said at the beginning. What is labor repressive agriculture? The idea of labor repressive agriculture is that where there exists these large landed estates, and particularly where there exist large landed estates that use political means to squeeze surplus from their agrarian direct producers, this was a big problem for democracy. This argument really is an argument that comes out of German discussions, right? So we all kind of know somewhere in the back of our minds that, well, what happened in Germany from the 15th to the 18th century, so going back a long way, right, was, right, that these areas began to export grain to the rest of Europe, to the more advanced areas of Europe, and that this grain export drive was basically led by, you know, large landed estate holders, the famous Junkers, right, who basically used what were essentially pre-existing feudal powers to squeeze their agricultural populations, right? And that kind of, that's the kind of idea of the second serfdom, and there are many, many other versions of this. But the thing that we need to realize about that is that that's a very old historical argument, and that by the mid-19th century, probably beginning in the Napoleonic Wars, but certainly by unification, in 1870, right, you are getting a form of agriculture that is highly productive. You have bankruptcies, you have basically market dependence. There's even some evidence that noble landholders are, you know, basically losing their fortunes to some extent. And there is a very impressive productivity development in German agriculture in the mid-19th century, especially in sugar beet cultivation. So this guy Perkins has kind of done a lot of work on this. And it's really important to note that because it really puts a problem on this whole notion that it's really the labor repressive sector that was this huge, problem for German political developments later, right? In fact, as I'm going to suggest, the argument here is essentially that, well, these backward agriculturalists really had to rely on state support in order to continue their activities in the context of extremely competitive agricultural markets. In fact, they were quite productive. They did rely on state support, but so did every other agricultural sector all over the world in the late 19th century. So there's nothing really particularly German about that. So this labor repressive agriculture argument is a real question. What about the United States? It's not a question in the United States. It's very obvious that there was labor repressive agriculture, right? One need only think, of course, of the great work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, of course, carried on by Eric Foner and many, many other scholars. What happened in the United States? What happened after slavery? Well, obviously, we should note, first of all, there was slavery in a third of the country, it's a huge area of the country, which was the former Confederacy. But then after slavery, what developed was this form of agriculture, sharecropping, which was a kind of halfway house between slavery and, you could say, a kind of independent peasantry. And sharecropping was very much dependent upon a whole series of institutions that restricted personal liberties in the South, right? We could summarize those things with the notion of Jim Crow, but it goes much beyond that. We have, of course, the system of debt peonage. You have the use of what is essentially kind of state-sponsored sort of renting out of labor gangs. And then, of course, above all, and most importantly, you have a form of legislation called the anti-enticement laws. And what anti-enticement laws were laws that made it a criminal offense to try to hire labor away from sharecropping farms in the South. This is labor, if there's labor repressive agriculture, this is it, right? So the point is to summarize that whole, like, why on earth am I talking about all that? Simply because to point out that if we think about the German and American cases in comparative perspective, what we see is that to the extent that we think about agriculture, that comparison runs, as it were, favorable to Germany, right? Germany is probably less labor repressive than the US. Germany does not have this huge agricultural sector. Germany doesn't have this huge labor repressive agricultural sector, and it doesn't really have anything quite like the Jim Crow system. It does have, of course, certain kind of particular suffrage arrangements that we can talk about, but nothing like you have in the American South. What about the strength of the bourgeoisie? Well, you could say, well, isn't it the case? Don't we all know that the German bourgeoisie is supposed to be, in the late 19th century, completely, they're completely suffused by these feudal ideas, and they're decadent and in decline. And hasn't everybody read their Buddenbrooks and all of that kind of stuff? This kind of group is not a real modern bourgeoisie. Well, I mean, drawing on the work of actually a guy who came to talk here, Jeff Ely, and Blackburn, and their kind of really important work on the so-called particular path or Sonderweg thesis. What they show is that if you look at basically the German political unit kind of right after unification, you see this incredibly powerful national liberal party. It's controlling between 120 and 150 seats in the lower house. It's able to pursue its interests through, of course, this very powerful network of political pressure groups such as Navy League, Defense League, Pan-German League, all of which are highly imperialist, which is a very important point about German capitalism. And just to summarize their conclusions, we might even argue that the nationalist pressure groups were Imperial Germany's authentic movement of bourgeois emancipation in their sociology, anti-clericalism, hostility to outmoded dynastic authority, and restless opposition to the traditional notable politics and zeal of self-confident citizen patriots. Of course, think about who is the kind of ultimate expression of this. It's kind of early Max Weber, right? This is the kind of person that you might think about as sort of embodying this sort of aggressive and forward-looking but extraordinarily imperialist German bourgeoisie. This is basically not a backward bourgeoisie at all. And it also, of course, invents a very highly efficient firm model based on this idea of vertical and horizontal integration that channels small savings into investment in an enormously creative and efficient way. So this is a strong, not a weak bourgeoisie. The US, of course, as well. The country after the Civil War probably creates the most powerful bourgeois party the world has ever seen, which I would say would be the Republican Party from about 1870 to about 1920. An extraordinary kind of run of control over the federal government, overseeing the build out of the railroad network that will link the entire continent, and basically overseeing the sort of integration of the North American continent, and also creating, of course, the organizational model of the modern corporation, which is somewhat similar in a sense to this German combination of vertical and horizontal integration. So it'd be hard to argue that the two cases differ too much in terms of this. What about the strength of their working classes? Well, what do we know? Well, if there's one place that had a strong working class anywhere at any time in history, it's got to be Germany, in the Imperial Germany, right? You got, by 1910, as we've already seen, we've got about a third of the labor forces working in manufacturing, right? And then, of course, after the abolition or the lifting of the anti-socialist laws in 1890, you have this incredible political organization, the SPD, right? Which becomes the largest party in the German Reichstag and is, of course, the world center of Orthodox Marxism, and is still kind of, this is the model working class party forever, really. In some ways, it's still the model of the working class party. I mean, if you read Jacobin, right? This is what they refer to. This is what a working class party is supposed to look like. It's not only is it politically popular, not only does it have this incredible reach into civil society, but it also has a kind of in-house intelligentsia that produces reports and all this kind of stuff. It is amazing. It's an amazing thing. So working class is clearly quite strong in Germany. But in the US, not so much. Frankly, right? You have the one thing I would like to note about the U.S. is that it's never had, in terms of the proportion of the population, proportion of the labor force, U.S. manufacturing labor force has never really been that large. It tops out at about 25% of the labor force. The U.S. is an early it's quite an early country in the rise of the service or third sector. The U.S. has an incredibly militant working class up until basically the late 19th century. But that militant working class is really defeated, and it's defeated very decisively in a couple important kind of turning points. The crushing of the Knights of Labor in 1886 is probably the key one. After that, you don't really get anything much of significance in terms of a party of labor. And obviously the US working class is split between what are essentially two coalitions of capitalists around the Republicans and the Democrats for the succeeding period. First, you could say, this history is a little complicated here, and I'll be returning to some of this in a bit, but you could say, initially the US working class there's a Republican and a Democratic wing. Like, it's not clear at all that which one of these parties is more pro-working class. The Republicans basically offer the native white working class kind of, even in the 19th century, essentially nativism and tariffs. And the Democrats make more of an appeal to the immigrant working class on the basis of a highly corrupt ethnic machine politics. But the basic message of this is there is no autonomous working class presence, really, even though there's a lot of militancy at the shop floor level. So let's think about that. Well, so we have, if we just to sort of like summarize our variables here, we've got a labor repressive agricultural comparison which is favorable to Germany. We have strong bourgeoisies in both cases, and then we have working class, which is probably stronger in Germany than it is in the US, right? So, you know, things aren't looking that great for the US in terms of these standard variables. What about the state? Surely this is the place where, the German Empire, after all, this must be the place to look. Well, let me push back on that idea a little bit here. Let's think about this. I'm just going to break down the political institutions in terms of 4 different things. We can think about them in terms of bureaucracy, we can think about suffrage extension, we can think about the role of the legislature, and we can think about federalism. Bureaucracy was, of course, Germany has this incredible bureaucratic tradition, which the United States utterly lacks. But one of the things that really means is that the US state is far more corrupt and patronage-ridden than the German state in this period. And it has a very particular consequence, actually, which is really important. Germany is an incredibly early country in the public financing of elections. So under the imperial Germany, you have basically very clean elections. Now you also have a very broad suffrage. So basically, to go to our second variable, basically if you aren't on public assistance, right, and you're not considered to be a criminal or a crazy person, you have broad male suffrage in imperial Germany. Now this is what I'm talking about is voting for the lower house, right? So obviously the federal house, or the Bundestag, is a different kettle of fish, and it is, in fact, of course, weighted by a franchise mechanism that favors Prussia, right? And so that's important. But lots of people are voting. There's lots of democratic activity, and it's not corrupt. Well, you say, well, what about the legislature? The important thing to understand here is that the legislature is utterly powerless in Germany. Well, not entirely. Lots of people are voting for legislation, right? There's for the legislature. It is able to pressure governments to some extent. And this variable also doesn't particularly distinguish between the German and the US cases. It would, of course, very much distinguish between the German and the British case, because the British case is a parliamentary system. But the lower house, in neither of these cases, is producing a government. The government, of course, is always an imperial government in Germany. In the US, it's the federal presidency. So these are quite similar in many ways. And of course, there are both of these are federal systems. In the federal system in Germany, as I was suggesting, you have a 3-class franchise that favors large landholders in Prussia. But of course, we know, since we just talked about this, we have the same basic structure in the United States. The Senate is by design, extremely anti-democratic institution with respect to the lower house, right? And also we have Jim Crow, right? So political institutions are not all that different in these countries in this period. All right. Now, what I want to suggest, however, is that there, of course, is an important difference. These cases end up in entirely different ways. So how do we think about how to explain those differences? I don't think we're going to be able to really do that in terms of the standard variables that I've talked about. So I just want to introduce at the end of the remarks here a different approach. And this is the idea what I will call basically a permissive geopolitical environment, right? And I just want to make the obvious point here, right, that the maybe most obvious difference between the US and Germany is that the US has an immense internal land empire, whereas Germany does not. And as a consequence, the US is completely external to the alliance system that, of course, Germany is torn between two alliance systems, this Western one, the kind of French, the kind of French English one, and then you have the problem of Russia and Austria-Hungary. And so Germany is in a much more seriously pressured, we could say, geopolitical condition. Now, how should we think about this? Just to sort of remind ourselves, if you were looking at if you were thinking about what are the most significant sort of events of the 19th century, well, German unification is incredibly important. It freaks everyone out, right? Particularly freaks out the British, right? Germany suddenly emerges and is immediately encircled by what are essentially kind of hostile powers around it. It's never able to establish much of an empire on its own, and it particularly can't do anything in Europe without basically challenging the existing balance of power. The US, after the Civil War, has this huge continent at its disposal, which it can occupy without basically bothering any other major power. And here, just quoting Giovanni Arrighi's point, he makes this point quite explicitly. The US had already, quote, solved its Lebensraum problem by the first half of the 19th century. Here's a piece of evidence that kind of shows this as well. This is a broader set of cases, but basically what we're looking at here is imperial territory divided by population in industry. And the clustering is interesting, but the main lines here that we would just like to draw your attention to are the black line, which shows it's basically thousands of miles of territory. It's just, as you can see, Germany has a very, very unimpressive footprint in imperial terms, whereas the US obviously has a much larger footprint. And as I'm saying, I'm sort of controlling for level of population in industry here. So the clustering is interesting because, of course, you see here that the three major kind of democratic cases in the late 19th century, or those cases that would become democratic, would be a better way to put it. France, the UK, and the US are up here. These are the imperial powers. Down below, we have the German line as the black line, and then I've also put in there the Italian and the Japanese one too. And this just is a way of basically graphically showing you that the real difference here between these are the authoritarian cases, those are the democratic cases, these are the failed imperialisms, those are the successful imperialisms. So this suggests maybe that we should be thinking about that. Now, what were the consequences of this? It's fine to say geopolitics matters, but how? I don't want to just say that, oh, it's just geopolitics. What are the mechanisms that link these different geopolitical positions to different political outcomes? And I think, or this would be my main sort of hypothesis, is that geopolitical position had the effect that it did, in particular, because it shaped the possibilities for what we could think of as bourgeois hegemony. That is to say, those cases that had significant empires were able, essentially, the bourgeoisie in those cases was able essentially to weld the working class to itself through a sense of national greatness that was in important respects not available to those countries that were losers in the geopolitical game, right? So the way I think to think about this, of course, is to say that geopolitics explains hegemony, and hegemony explains the outcome that we're after. Where the bourgeoisie could establish hegemony, it could, as it were, afford a relatively democratic system. Where it could not so afford. And so that the idea, that's the idea that I'm sort of after in this set of remarks. There are two dimensions on this I just want to suggest. I'm going to suggest an economic dimension, and then I'm going to suggest a kind of ideological or political dimension. So in the economic dimension, one of the things that's really remarkable about if you think about this US and German comparison a little bit, is that basically both of these countries in the late 19th century are relying pretty heavily on tariffs to protect their industries and agricultures in different ways. But whereas in Germany, tariffs are incredibly controversial, and they, in fact, tend to split the country along class lines. The SPD is always deeply opposed to tariffs. And in fact, Karl Kautsky attributes at one point, the repeal of the Corn Laws to the strength of the British working class. And what he meant by that, or what he's suggesting by that, is that the working class is strong, it's a pro-free trade force. This was Kautsky's line, right? In contrast, in the US, tariffs were highly popular, both with industry and with workers. Why is that the case? It's the case in part, I would suggest, because workers in the US had access, they didn't care about that. They weren't importing their grain. They were essentially eating locally produced stuff because they existed in a giant land empire. So there is this kind of ability, there's an economic dimension of the hegemonic alliance that emerged in the US as a consequence of its geopolitical position. But there's also an important ideological dimension, and perhaps this is even more important. As I was suggesting, you could say the project of German imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century was never popular. It was not a particularly popular position. It specifically never really incorporated the SPD, which was always, even in my opinion, although of course they cave in 1914, they're still quite an anti-imperialist force right up through the turn of the 20th century. That is in total contrast to the US, where basically after the election of William McKinley, US imperialism becomes what I would see as a genuinely popular force that sort of allows the working class to ally with a great power state and makes workers a much less threatening force than they were in Germany. To give you a little bit more sort of evidence on this question of like what is going on with the American working class, this is kind of interesting evidence. It's essentially, this is turnout evidence from 1800 to around, up to 1996, I guess the evidence runs. And the thing that I want to point out here, the US is a kind of very strange country in terms of its electoral participation. And the real turning point is 1900, where you see basically highly mobilized electorate that falls off a cliff through those first few decades of the 20th century. And part of what's going on there, I think, is on the one hand, a kind of imperialist incorporation of the working class, but also, and at the same time, an incredible dose of nativism and repression of the working class. Both of these things are going on. I would note also, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, as you can see, the South has been sort of hived off here. It's the gray line there. That's interesting because basically what you're seeing here around the later 1880s, you're seeing the institution of the Jim Crow regime. And you see a complete collapse of electoral participation in the South. So what you basically have at that moment is a very profound demobilization of the threat of any threat to capital from below, beginning in the late 19th century. I actually think that's a key element to unraveling the story about U.S. Capitalist democracy and its relative success. So what I've tried to say here, just tried to suggest here, is that when thinking about the relationship between these factors and the political outcome of a democracy or authoritarianism, we have to consider geopolitical position. I believe that geopolitics played a role in shaping the class structures of each of these cases, but in particular, it played a role in shaping the possibilities of a hegemonic alliance between basically the bourgeoisie and the working class, and that where that alliance was in place, there you could get capitalist democracy. Where it wasn't, you could not. So we really need to think about, this is another way of saying this, is we really need to think about imperialism to solve the problem, at least the problem that I'm after. You might not find that particularly interesting, but that's my view. This just sums up, then I'm just going to sum up very briefly what I've tried to say here. Basically just arguing that if we look at these two cases in terms of these different factors, they don't differ in the ways that we would predict. And where they do differ, it's favoring, in quotes, it's favoring Germany, not the US, right? Germany has less labor-repressive agriculture and a stronger working class than does the US. So that poses this question, why the different outcome? I'm suggesting, obviously, geopolitical environment. So to sum up just the basic conclusions that I want to draw, you cannot ascribe the different political evolutions of Germany and the US to German backwardness in US development. I've tried to argue that their capitalisms were highly comparable. These were the two leading capitalist powers of the 19th century. Slightly more controversially, perhaps, I'm arguing that the different political evolutions of these countries cannot be ascribed to their state structures either. In many respects, the German nation state was more modern than the US state. It had less corrupt institutions, and in some ways it had a broader suffrage regime, at least for its lower house. The real difference, therefore, between the cases I'm suggesting concerns the US peculiarity of the acquisition of a massive land empire in the period after 1870. That's what set the US onto what I see as a very special path. That suggests, generally speaking, we need in political sociology to incorporate and take much more seriously theories of geopolitics and empire, especially in this kind of discussion about dictatorship and democracy. And finally, what I'd like to say is that perhaps this whole question about authoritarianism is rather badly posed. That is to say, the puzzle might be why it was that the US, and in a few other cases, notably the UK and France, were able to avoid the German path that to a certain extent was the natural path, the default path of capitalist development. What were the particular conditions that explained their evolution rather than the German? So that's all I've got to say. Looking forward to your guys' comments about the presentation. Thanks very much.